Internet Explorer hasn't changed significantly in the recent past, so if you're familiar with it from Windows 8 or even Windows 7, you'll probably be okay with it in Windows 10. However, let's just run through how to configure Internet Explorer. Click the cog icon up here and then you can choose Manage Add-ons, Compatibility View Settings and Internet Options. Most of the configuration is done through Internet Options. On the general page you can configure your home page. You can configure how startup works, whether you go to the home page or you open up the tabs from the last session. You can configure how new tabs are displayed, you can manage your browsing history, and you can change the appearance of Internet Explorer. On the Security tab, you can configure different security zones. There are 4: Internet, Local Intranet, Trusted Sites and Restricted Sites. Each of those is pre-configured with a set of security settings. So for example, on Internet Zone, we use medium-high. You can configure the security levels for the different zones and you can add sites to each of these zones. Well worth spending some time configuring this tab before you take the exam. The privacy page allows you to view sites and configure advanced properties for privacy settings and turn off pop-up blocker and enable or disable toolbars and extensions when you're in private browsing. Content page allows you to manage digital certificates, autocomplete and feeds and web slices. You're probably not going to use the Connections tab often. That's only useful really if you have a particularly unusual local area network setup for accessing the internet. For most users you won't need to do anything on this page. On the Programs tab you can specify how you open an Internet Explorer. When you select links, it will always use Internet Explorer on the desktop. You can manage your add-ons. You can specify an HTML editor, and you can define your internet programs, so which services you'll use for email and so on. Also, you can specify file associations. On the Advanced tab, you can configure some fine detail about the behavior of Internet Explorer on various sites. So let's take a look at all of that in action when we look at a demonstration of configuring Internet Explorer. So let's take a look at configuring Internet Explorer. Unlike Microsoft Edge, it's not pinned to the taskbar, so I'm going to need to locate it. It's actually in a folder at the bottom of the apps list, but I'll type at least part of its name, and then I'll right-click Internet Explorer and choose Pin to Taskbar. I've configured it to open in a blank page, but you can configure that as you'll see in a moment. So to configure the options, click on the cog here, Tools, and choose Internet Options. You can also configure add-ons and compatibility view settings. If a website that you visit doesn't work properly in Internet Explorer 11, choose compatibility view settings and you can configure it to run in an earlier version or run as if it's in an earlier version of Internet Explorer. It can sometimes get around a problem with a particular website expecting a particular version. Under Internet Options, you've got the tabbed dialog box here. The home page is configured to be about blank, but I can use the default, or I can use a new tab, or I can use whatever is the current page that I'm looking at. When I open up Internet Explorer, it can start with the home page, which is what I've configured it to do, or start with tabs from whatever was the last browsing session. I can change how websites are displayed in tabs, and I can manage my browsing history here. I can also change the basic appearance. On the Security tab, you have a number of predefined zones. Each one of these zones, Internet, Local Intranet, Trusted Sites and Restricted Sites, has a different level of security pre-configured. You simply need to add sites to the appropriate zones to have those security settings enforced. So for example, if you visit a site that you find is very untrustworthy, you can select Restricted Sites, click the Sites button, and then type in the URL and type add. If you're actually on the site at the moment, then it will pre-fill this field to the site that you're looking at the moment. If a site is trustworthy, click on the Trusted Sites option, click Sites, and again it predisposes itself to use the existing site, the site that you're looking at. But you can type in any URL here. Note that for trusted sites, the default is to require server verification, in other words, an HTTPS prefix. You can clear that if you want to, but you need to be careful about adding non-SSL sites to this list, because you can't genuinely verify that the site is who it claims to be. You can adjust the security settings for each of the zones, but you need to be careful doing that. You need to know what you're doing. So for example, on internet, I can choose medium-high security, or I can drag it up to very high, and that will make a change. Or I can configure the custom level and go through each of these options. On the Privacy tab, you can configure cookie behavior on the Sites button here, based on each individual site that you visit. You can also configure privacy settings on an advanced basis by configuring first-party and third-party cookies here. Pop-up blocker is enabled by default, but you can configure the settings on a per-site basis, and you can configure default blocking levels based on pre-configured settings. On the Content tab, you can configure SSL and certificate settings. Certificates are a very important way of identifying servers and websites as being who they say they are. At the core of that is your computer's ability to understand where a certificate came from, and that's what you configure on the Publishers button here. So you can specify which certificates and from which publishers you're prepared to trust. Windows 10 supports a wide variety of certificate types from a number of different certificate publishers, but you may need to configure these slightly differently for your organizational needs. On the Connections tab, you probably won't need to configure anything. It's highly unlikely. But if there's a peculiarity about the way a particular computer connects to the internet, perhaps it goes through a proxy, or there are particular local area network settings that you need to account for, then you might need to visit this page. Given the likelihood of that, I'm not going to spend long looking at it. On the Programs tab, you can specify when you open Internet Explorer what happens. You can specify managing add-ons. Add-ons are functional components that do specific things within web pages. So for example, you've got an option here for link click to call. So if you see a link contact and you click it, it will open up Link, what we now call Skype for Business. There are various accelerators available and search providers, so you can turn those on or off as you need. And then you can specify an editor for HTML editing, and you can specify which particular programs you want to use for things like browsing or email or whatever. So in actual fact, that just takes us to a link in Control Panel for setting your default programs. And then file associations. So if a particular file is located on a web page, then what will Internet Explorer do? What program will it open based on that file extension? And the Advanced tab finally allows you to configure fine detail about the way your browsing experience works. It's not something you'll probably spend a lot of time looking at unless there's a specific need, a specific requirement for a particular user. So in the demonstration, you saw how to configure Internet Explorer.